I now have the great pleasure of introducing someone recently described to me as, by text, sensitivity off the scale. That was sent to me by someone who sent me a text to say how disappointed they are not in the audience with us. They are talking about the founder and executive director of the Compassion Prison Project. She's also an award-winning filmmaker, best known to many of you probably by the film Step Inside the Circle, which we will get a chance to experience this afternoon if you wish. But this morning, she's going to share with us what she has learned about compassion, about pain, and about healing, and what she has observed during her time on Scottish soil. Fritzi Horstman, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this stage.
Do your best and work with good luck.
It's so great being here. And I want to thank my hosts, Cisco, Smithy, Tigers. Dear Fritzi, I'm still here in solitary. It's been 7 months, and it will be closer to a year by the time they let me back in general population. Being locked in a tiny concrete box with no windows where the door doesn't open unless you're handcuffed, most times shackled like Hannibal Lecter, and the only time you get to go outside is in a small cage, alone, in the middle of the desert. It will be strange interacting with people again. There are a few moments where my mind started to slide, but I made it so far. Sincerely, Ezra. When is the moment we decide someone is no longer human? Is it when they're born black, brown, or poor? When they believe in a different God or a different church? When their politics don't agree with ours? When is the moment we decide it's okay to put someone and torture them in solitary confinement? Is it when they step outside the line? When they're, sorry, I'm a little nervous. When they step outside the line. When is it okay to incarcerate someone for the majority of their life? When they're addicted to drugs? When they've killed their abuser? When they're actually innocent? What you probably already know is that dehumanization is a trauma response. What you may not know is that the way we respond to crime and incarcerate the men and women with violence, abuse, neglect, torture, and sometimes murder are all trauma responses. So what I'm saying is, prisons are a trauma response. Prisons have lost their common sense. They've lost their understanding of human needs and potential. They've lost their perspective of what creates true safety and a cohesive society. Prisons are not in their right mind. But trauma responses can be healed, and so can prisons, and prison residents, and prison officers, and their families, and our communities, and our society. And when that trauma response is healed, everyone in the criminal justice system will be in their right mind, in their cortex, the place where wisdom and compassion live, where solutions and possibilities thrive, where forgiveness is possible, where transformation occurs. In this talk, we're going to talk about moving to the possibility, moving from the trauma response that is our prison system to a system that is trauma-informed, from dehumanization to the recognition of everyone's intrinsic humanity, from systemic oppression to true justice and the pursuit of happiness for every man, woman, and child living in this world, incarcerated or not. I'm going to start by talking about how I started working in prisons. It begins with my childhood growing up. My father is 6'6". He was 6'6". And clothes didn't fit him well. He came back from Vegas with a brand new suede jacket, and he looked so good in it, and he was so proud to be in that jacket. 3 days later, I visited his apartment. He lived 3 blocks away from my mom. I walked in, and it was like a crime scene. Plants and dirt were scattered all over the floor. They were fighting in the kitchen. And I went into the bedroom, and there on the bed was his suede jacket cut up into pieces. My parents fought for hours, and I was in the house with them. It escalated to a point where I went to the kitchen and got a knife. Someone called the cops, and they came to de-escalate the situation. And I cried. I cried till morning. So those events, those traumatic events like that affected my behavior. I was an accessory to a robbery. I sold drugs. I stole scales from my high school. I shoplifted thousands of dollars. I did all kinds of drugs when I was 16. Needless to say, I was traumatized by all of that. Unfortunately, I wasn't aware of it, and I didn't work on my healing. Fast forward 40 years, and I'm in the kitchen with my son, and he's 12 years old. Now, the kitchen was a trauma zone for me. My mother would criticize me and tell me I wasn't doing good enough in the kitchen. So being in the kitchen for me, even last night, was a trauma zone. And sometimes when I need a spoon, I don't even know how to get one, and I'm in fight or flight in the trauma zone. So my son, Conrad, he's flipping a peanut butter jar in the kitchen, and I'm asking him to stop because the chaos is really getting to my trauma. And he's flipping it, and bam, it falls on the floor. And I scream. And I see that I've traumatized my child once again. And I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what that was. But needless to say, I needed help. Dear Fritzi, it's so crazy. I see trauma in every life in here and how it has played a huge part in their sorrow. If only they could find the courage to confront their past and let it go. So, fast forward to when I'm 56 years old. I'm 59 right now. I had coffee with my friend Seth. And for some reason, I told him about the abuse I had experienced in my childhood: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, domestic violence, alcoholism, a person in the family mentally ill, 8 ACEs in total. And he said, please read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. I read that book, and in that moment, it changed my life because I realized that my behavior in the kitchen was not who I was. That was my trauma doing its job. That was my body doing its job to keep me safe, whether there was a threat or not. And that's the key, whether there was a threat or not. So I began my journey to healing. And it led me to prisons. So I walked into a prison, I've always been worried about African Americans in the US. I always wondered why we treated them so badly and why there were so many African Americans incarcerated. So when someone invited me to go to Kern Valley State Prison, I said, yes, I want to see what's going on. But I had that idea that this is a prison and this is going to be a bad place and there are going to be bad people in there. I walked in. The second I got in, I knew I had been lied to for all of my life. These were not bad people, these were traumatized people. And when I went to they asked all the volunteers to introduce themselves. And I said, this isn't a prison, this is a trauma care center. Just nobody knows it. And so I walked out of there and I wrote in my journal, I said, I am obligated to do something. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I was clueless about how do I go about changing the entire prison system, not only in the United States, but in the world. But I knew I could do it. I knew somehow this is going to happen. And so I created a really, really ridiculous curriculum. I investigated kindness and compassion, and I did all the wrong things. But within four times visiting those men, they taught me what they needed to know. And they showed me how to work the circle. We created the circle together. And it changed my life. It changed my life because when I helped them heal themselves, they helped me heal me. And the circle continued, and suddenly I found myself healing. So I'm going back to that slide. I like that slide, the problem. It may be hard to believe, but the biggest mental health facilities in the US are the Chicago jail, the Los Angeles jail, and the New York City jail. Approximately 72% of US prisoners meet the criteria for a mental health disorder. And I'm going to be talking a lot about the US, but I believe a lot of these statistics are similar here. I'm sorry, I don't have those statistics. I've done some research. The Prison Officers Association has some great information, but it's all about the officers, which is also an important issue. And this is at Barlini, this photo. 80%, up to 80% of the men and women in prison have traumatic brain injuries. And when we were in Barlini, it looked like every single man had a gash on his head. Traumatic brain injuries affect the prefrontal cortex. So you're more inclined to be aggressive, more inclined to be disoriented, unable to understand commands, unable to understand consequences. Traumatic brain injury is one of the biggest issues we have in our society besides trauma. And adverse childhood experiences. I'm just going to go through the list. I'm assuming everyone knows, but I want you to just a refresher. When I first took the ACE quiz, I thought I had 4 of them. I thought, oh yeah, I just have 4. But I looked deeper and I kept taking the test. I don't know why, but it's like, oh yeah, no, the domestic violence, that was my mother hitting my father. That's still domestic violence. That still affected me as a child, because a child can't understand that the person in front of them that's being beaten is not him or herself. So, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, parents divorced or separated, domestic violence, parent or caregiver addicted to drugs or alcohol, parent or caregiver who is depressed or mentally ill, household member ever been incarcerated. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the brain science just so you understand that when the brainstem is always scanning for safety. So in here we feel pretty safe, we feel pretty regulated. But if someone would charge into that door yelling something, our amygdala would send an alarm, the amygdala, and we might flip our lids or we might brace ourselves. But if that constantly happens, oh, and the prefrontal cortex goes offline. And look at all the things that the prefrontal cortex governs. behavior control, inhibition of behavior, planning, empathy, wisdom, compassion, social interactions, social emotional regulation, organization, ability to pay attention, and a host of other things, learning and understanding that you're safe in a community. In the US, we surveyed over 3,000 incarcerated men and women throughout the US. So in the US, 64% of the population have at least one adverse childhood experience. In prison, it's 98% have at least one. And that was just for the top 10, but if you include things like homelessness, extreme poverty, traumatic brain injury, that number goes to 100%. So you have 100% of the people in prison are traumatized. They're not in their right mind. They're in fight or flight, and if they're in prison, they're in a place where they can't trust anything. In the US, 15% of people have experienced 4 or more ACEs. In prison, in our studies, up to 79% have experienced 4 or more ACEs. But here's a staggering number. 64% of the men and women that we've surveyed have 6 or more ACEs. And when I did the circle here, that number was the same. So, and remember, when you have 6 or more ACEs, your life expectancy goes down by 20 years. That's because of the hypervigilance, the stress, the toxic stress, the lack of an immune response. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with high adversity, high trauma. And the thing is, no one knows they're traumatized. I didn't know I was traumatized. And I bet most of the people in Scotland don't know they're traumatized. And when we did the circles at Addywell, Barlinnie, and Edinburgh, at Sawton? They didn't know they were traumatized either. And that's the magic of awareness, is when people know they're traumatized. When they know their brain is injured, they can learn how to heal. So, for prison residents, 98% have witnessed or been involved with violent situations, but we just discussed it's actually 100%. They also die by suicide at a rate of 3.5 times the national US average. So we're back to the US again, but remember, this is in parity here. They lose approximately 2 years of life for every year confined. That's because of the constant stress. 60% experience moderate to severe symptoms of PTSD. And for people who commit crimes, they commit a moral injury, which goes against their soul, goes against something that they know they shouldn't be doing, or they witness something that they shouldn't see. What they find with moral injury, and this is really for people going to war, they're constantly doing things that they don't believe that they should be doing. What they found is with moral injury, if it's repeated and it's many times, they lose their sense of empathy. So not only in prison are we dealing with people with an enlarged amygdala, a toxic stress, and an exaggerated fight-flight response. We're dealing with people who have lost their access to empathy. And empathy is built during the formative years. That serve and return that the mother gives to the child says goo, and the mother says goo. And it's that back and forth, and it's that connection and that understanding that there's a human there that matters, and that I'm a little human that matters. And that's what creates empathy. And when a child doesn't get that growing up, it's hard to build that. But we have solutions. So this is Kern Valley, where I spent a year and 2 months working with the men. And those are their cells. This is a maximum security prison. The men stay in their cells 23 hours a day unless they have a class of education or a program or a job. Otherwise, they're in their cell with their cellie or not. What struck me about Kern Valley State Prison, it's in the middle of a desert. And when I walked on the grounds for this first time, I asked the administrator, I said, "Where are the trees?" He says, "We can't have trees because we need a sight line so we can kill the person if they're trying to escape." So that's their philosophy. Why have trees when you can kill somebody? So here I am. This is me visiting prison. This is before I was in the Compassion Prison Project. And if you look at the guy, I don't know how, to the right, he looks a lot like James Dougherty, doesn't he? He was also formerly incarcerated. That's Corey. And I think they're brothers because they have the same huge spirit. So after I started my curriculum, we went to Valley State Prison, and you can see me how intense I am staring at Richard there. But I saw Richard and his heart was closed. And I said, you know what, I gotta go be with that man. And within 10 minutes, his heart opened just a little bit. And in this other picture, that's Lewis. Lewis was suicidal that day. And Nadine Burke-Harris came that day also. And between her, myself, and 12 volunteers and the community of those men, Lewis is still alive. He just wrote me another email. And he's still struggling, but he's here. But it was that work we did that day, that work we made sure he's our brother. He matters. Doesn't matter what he did. It matters who he is. But I also want to say, those two men in that photo are in life without parole. So that means in the US, those men don't have the ability to ever go home unless they prove themselves to be extraordinary. Interesting. But I want to talk about the victims, because there are victims here. I'm a victim. Many of you have had adverse childhood experiences, so you've been a victim as well, and many of you have been victims of crime. And I don't want to diminish anything about your crime, anything that happened to you. What happened to you was horrendous. But our work is so there are no more victims. Our work is so that we don't create more victims. 95% of the people in prison will be going home. So, and we have, it's another slide coming up, but if we have a recidivism rate in the US of 66%, that means we're creating more victims. So my work is to prevent any more harm. And I truly believe that our work is to remind the people in prison that they're human. So here I am, doing my thing, just telling these guys they matter. This guy, Eric, that I'm shaking hands with, he's been in prison for 28 years for a crime he didn't commit. But I said to Eric, I said, you know what? There's a reason you're here. And instead of being a victim and saying, you know what, I should be out, I should be out, I should be out, I said, get busy. Get busy and start changing it in here instead of waiting for somebody to let you out. And that's just me sitting with Richard and those beautiful men. Dear Fritzi, I'm a 36-year-old white male serving a 51 to life sentence under California's three-strike law for a series of armed bank and business robberies. I grew up severely abused as a child, physically and verbally, by my mother, who was left alone with 4 small children after my father was sentenced to 16 years in state prison for a string of residential burglaries. My mother ran an escort service to provide for herself and her children, going from one abusive relationship to the next. She was also a survivor of severe child abuse, physically and sexually. I witnessed her attempt suicide multiple times, watched her get beaten severely by her boyfriends, watched her do illicit drugs, and in turn was abused severely by her, as all my siblings were. So in the US, loss of freedom now means loss of all human rights, loss of voting rights, loss of a sense of agency, loss of humanity, loss of good food. When did we decide it was okay to feed someone food labeled not fit for human consumption? So private industries in the US profit big from mass incarceration. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. In Oklahoma, the food budget for one person is $1 a day. I also want to talk about the phone. We're profiting off of people just by making phone calls. A phone call can cost up to $25 for 15 minutes. A mother had to decide between her light bill, paying her light bill, or talking to her son. So she talked to her son in the dark. And the commissary, this is a place where people can buy things. The prices are 4 times the retail rate that we pay. I go to Costco and a soup costs 15 cents. In there, it's 75 cents. Why are we doing this to the most vulnerable and impoverished people in our society? Here's some more lovely food that people are supposed to eat. A lot of people in prison go hungry because they can't stomach the food. And there's one more thing called Nutriloaf, which is called food punishment. It's a loaf that they put together for people who've been bad, usually in solitary. Usually when someone in solitary who wants to be touched and will do anything they can, they'll throw urine and feces on the guards. And that will get them food punishment and also more isolation. Oops, sorry. Dear Fritzi, the world is sad, especially living in solitary. It takes such a strong mind just to endure, and it's sad seeing men's will and their spirit break back here. And the lack of compassion on both sides, inmates and guards. How do you survive in a loveless world? I don't know how I kept my heart throughout everything I've experienced in my life. I don't want to become hardened to lose my heart. So solitary confinement. According to the UN, the United Nations, more than 14 days in solitary is considered torture. I've worked with men that have been in solitary for 30 to 40 years. One of the men that I worked with, he was in there for 8 years. He got out, and now he goes to work, and now he comes home, and he just wants to be in his room alone. So we've created an agoraphobic. And in the United States, if you want to do an experiment of isolation on a rat, you have to get permission. So this is Rick Ramish, and he got rid of long-term solitary in his prison. 14 days were the most. He spent a night in solitary, and he cites an 80% reduction of violence after getting rid of long-term solitary. But in that night that he spent, he felt disoriented. He didn't know what time it was, and he didn't get much sleep because of the noise in the halls. He says solitary is overused, misused, and abused. So this is at Pelican Bay, where we bring the worst of the worst, and that's where they have their group sessions in those cages. Isn't that lovely? The physical effects of solitary include eyesight deterioration, but what's interesting is you can't see the horizon literally and figuratively. Also fatigue and lethargy, sleep problems, weight loss. Mental health effects, anxiety and stress, depression and hopelessness, anger, irritability, and hostility. Why? Because your amygdala is going off the chain. It senses the body's in danger with it, which it is, because the brain is a social organ, or I don't know if it's an organ, but it's a social thing, and it wants to connect. That's how the brain knows it's safe. That's how we all know we're safe. Right now, we're all regulated. We feel safe. Our brain feels connected. We see people. We know we're okay. We know there are people in the back that have our back. You don't have that in solitary. Social withdrawal, right? There are people that will stay in once the people on death row in California, they're about to move them into the general population, but they don't want to because they've been there for so many years in isolation. They can't imagine a world where they have to interact with people, and self-harm and suicide. The US recidivism rate is around 65%. That means that more than two-thirds of the people who leave prison will end up returning to prison. Why? Because it's a revolving door. So this I found so interesting. The Cincinnati Declaration. In 1870, the newly established American Correctional Association met in Cincinnati and issued a Declaration of Principles which included the following: The penal system should be based on reformation, not suffering, and prisoners should be educated to be free, industrious citizens able to function in society, not orderly inmates controlled by the guards. Good conduct should be rewarded, meaning, I think, if you can display that you're good, you serve less time. Indeterminate sentencing, like life without parole, not a mandated exact sentence, should include the ability for prisoners to earn their freedom early through hard work and good behavior. Citizens should understand that society is responsible for the conditions that lead to crime. Prisoners should recognize they can change their lives. That's what we do at Compassion Prison Project. We say, you matter, and your brain was injured, and you can turn that around, and you can change lives. You can change your life, the life of your family, the life of your community. When we did the circle at Barlini, there was one man, I think his name was Darren. He was wearing a red shirt, but a lot of people were wearing a red shirt. He had done the circle, and I said, how are you doing? How's it going? And he said, I have 7 aces, and my child has 7 aces. And tonight I'm going to call my family, and we're going to end this generational trauma. Just 2 hours of working in that circle, his life was changed. But not only his life, his children's life, his girlfriend's life, and possibly generations to come, the life of generations to come. If what we were doing in the past was working, we wouldn't be building more prisons. And I have to salute Scotland for what they're doing with the youth, understanding that their brains are not developed until 25, sometimes 30 years old. The man isn't developed. I knew that instinctively. As like, when I was dating guys in my 20s and 30s, I was like, what's wrong with these people? And I said to myself, I'm not going to really date anyone until he's 33, because that's when he's ready to settle down and stop the shenanigans. So, but it took me till I was 43 before I found the right guy. Anyway, long story. Dear Fritzi, they say convicts are the violent, ignorant ones, but the guards froth at the mouth at the first hint of discord and annihilate any form of unity and compassion, of peace. How do you give another man the power over another human that the prison system does? The power to take a life with a gun, the power to beat with batons and pepper spray, the power to take away your visitations with family. They have all the power when they have more emotional and mental hang-ups than you and I combined. Now I want to say, my visit to Scotland, has nothing to do with this description. The men and women working in prisons in Scotland are an extraordinary bunch of humans. They're concerned. They advocate for the people in prison. I was like, wow, this is nothing like I've seen in the US. I was so relieved to know that the men and women here were seen as humans. And maybe this is not true for all prisons in Scotland. Maybe this was just all the good guards were showing up so I could see. I don't know. But Jim is over there, and he was wearing a mask, but I could see his smile through the mask, and I knew this was a good man. But when he wanted them to leave the room, I was like, whoa, he's pretty intense. And also just to say, the administrations of all 3 prisons were exemplary, really. I'm very impressed, very, very impressed. Governor Abernathy, Paul Batten, Mike, or is it Jim? I thought he was you, and I kept, anyway. And James, or Jimmy, anyway, Jimmy. Astounding, like off the charts. What I saw here were the ingredients of possibility. But what I also saw is that the men and women were in their cells for 23 hours. Sometimes they go out. There's, 4 or 5 hours sometimes. I don't know. I really don't know. And all I could imagine was an Excel sheet of when people can get out and can get in and get out. And in the US, I'll be talking about this later, but I'm just here now. In the US, when people demonstrate that they're not violent, they go to less restrictive prisons so that they can get more programming and get out of their cells and be in a pro-social environment. And that's the piece that I got about a month ago, is that criminals, people who commit crimes, have antisocial behavior. The serve and return that we talked about is not online. They don't know what that means. They don't know what giving and taking. They don't know signs. They don't know those signs of, those little signs of a little smile or a little nod. They don't know what that means. And that's why people in prison need to be in community safely. I understand there's a big issue here because we don't know how they're going to react. And all those things, I understand it's a big math puzzle. I see what you're going through. But I also know that when you isolate them, they're left to their own thoughts. And those thoughts aren't good. Those thoughts are very destructive. And they lead to more drug abuse. They lead to more violent behavior. And that's what solitary does. So in solitary, they're in there for 23 hours, 1 hour for a shower and a walk. And then they're back. And I said to a guard, I said, what do you think of solitary? This is in the US. He says, it's called administrative segregation. People talk to them all day. I'm like, they check in on them, but that's not like having a connection. That's not having the serve and return that changes our wiring. When did we decide to give correctional officers the power to determine the fate of men and women living in prison? I'm not talking about the ones here. I'm talking about in the US. They can actually extend your sentence for years and years. And did you know that the average life expectancy of a correctional officer in the US is 59 years old? I'm 59. I'm just getting started. So imagine being 59 and having your life taken away. And in the UK, it's about 69. It's about 2 years after retirement. So I hear retirement's about 68. So it's still, the job is still stressful here. And that's because of all the violence and the adversity and the toxic stress that goes through a prison officer's body. There's also in the US a 39% higher rate of death by suicide. PTSD, trauma and stress, 35% for men, 29% for women in the US. I think those numbers are 70 to 80%, and they're very high here as well. You can check the Prison Officer Association report from 2020, and you can see, I just didn't have time to bring it all here. A 2001 survey of correctional staff showed staggering rates of depression, feelings of hopelessness, and thoughts of suicide. Sounds very similar to a prison resident. 25% cited lack of emotional responsiveness, 20% inability to find pleasure in anything, and 13% hopelessness and worthlessness. And 20% higher chance of separation and divorce than the national average. This is in the US. I'm not sure about the rates here, but I'm sure when someone comes home after a violent day, it's not good for the family. And overtime. So from what I can tell, in all these 3 prisons, there's a staff shortage, which means moving people out of their cells into groups, getting them to their meals and stuff. It's another Excel sheet. And it also means more overtime for the people that do work there. And that takes a toll. They have physical and cognitive and emotional issues. They make mistakes, become complacent, become short-tempered, use excessive force due to irritability. I don't think that's true here, but I've seen it in the US. And lack of sleep. Maybe it's true here, I don't know. But lack of sleep. So if you're on 16 hours a day, 3 or 4 times a week, and you have to drive home and you have to, have your tea or whatever happens. Next thing you know, you're getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep. If you have 19 hours, your blood alcohol level, it mimics having too many drinks. It's a 0.5%, but if you have 24 hours of being awake, that's like driving home drunk. And so people are driving home exhausted and basically drunk. And burnout, emotional exhaustion, feeling emotionally drained from working with prisoners. Depersonalization and citicism, treating some prisoners like impersonal objects and not really caring what happens to them. And reduced personal accomplishment, feeling that they are making no difference to prisoners' lives. So this is from the UK, because in the US, they don't care about making a difference in prisoners' lives, in prison residents' lives. So correctional officers, 73% have seen someone seriously hurt or killed while on the job. Correctional staff die by a suicide rate at 2.5 times the national average. Life expectancy is 59 years old. 34% meet the criteria for PTSD, 5 times the national rate. And moral injury, again, lack of empathy. So trauma and PTSD create disconnection from mind, body, heart, community, family, self. So when I'm traumatized, when I was 8 years old, I had that thought, I'm by myself. I can't count on my family. They're nuts. And I've had that thought, and it still lived with me throughout my life. And I've been a workaholic for a long time in my life. Just got to drink a little something. Oh, it's so good. Okay, so this is so cool. So the photo of the person, he's in solitary. He's looking outside. This is from a film, A Solitary Confinement. But people in prison don't know that they're traumatized. Prison officers don't know they're traumatized. People living in prison don't know the prison officers are traumatized. Prison officers don't know prison residents are traumatized. Although the prison officers in here know that they're traumatized. And so here we go. We're rehashing this, but look at the juxtaposition. 98% of prison residents have witnessed or been involved with violent situations. 73% of prison officers have seen someone seriously hurt or killed while on the job. Prison residents die by suicide at the rate of 3.0 times the national average. Officers die by suicide at 2.5 times the national average. Residents lose approximately 2 years of life for each year confined. Life expectancy is 59 years old, or 68 here. 60% experience moderate to severe symptoms of PTSD. 34 meet the criteria for PTSD, 5 times the national rate, but I believe it's 60 to 80%. Moral injury. And they're all in the same building. So, what could be? Shift from punitive to rehabilitative. Dear Fritzi, I imagine a system where common sense prevails, where understanding prevails, with just a touch of human compassion, where a smile isn't kicked to pieces with malicious intent as soon as it's made, where a seed of kindness isn't dug up and destroyed before it can take root just because it's different. The solution. Prisons become trauma-informed, pro-social communities. A pro-social community, you're talking a lot to each other. You're making plans, you're having meals together, you're sitting around. Just like a college campus, that brain will start rewiring. We saw it yesterday, the brains at, I'm going to call it Edinburgh, HMP Edinburgh, because I'm going to get it wrong. But we saw their brains rewiring in real time. They felt safer with each other. They felt more regulated. They were laughing. They were dancing. And they were forgiving themselves. And they said, I've never had anything like this before. Thank you. They were grateful. And yesterday they came in a little dysregulated, but they said, we didn't get enough time to come down from the first session. But they told us what they needed, and I really think the people in prison know what they need. They just need to have a voice and have a stake in the conversation. With safety, though, I understand safety is an issue. I understand it, and that's the thing I always try and walk in the shoes of an officer or a governor or a warden and think, okay, what are they dealing with? And they want to keep their staff safe at all costs. I get that. And the prison residents at all costs. But what are the costs of lockdown? So Framingham facility in Massachusetts, they did some trauma-informed work, and they cite a 62% decrease in inmate assaults on staff, a 54% decrease on inmate assaults, 60% decline on one-on-one mental health watches, and a 16% decline in psychiatric petitions. So this is my dream, so I'm putting it out there so you guys know what I'm thinking. But this is at Lancaster. This is on a yard. A yard is called an honor yard. You guys might call it a recovery yard. But they're out of their cells probably 12 hours a day. This guy is in the dog program where they're training dogs for the veterans so that those dogs, and it's heartbreaking, they have to leave their dogs and give them to veterans, but those veterans, they're changing the world, they're giving back to society. An incredible, incredible program. So residents, peer-to-peer groups daily, educational programs, tablets and computer access, which I think you have at Addie Well, but I don't know about the other two. I don't remember everything. Job opportunities and job pay. So when people leave prison, they're going into a vacuum. Maybe they have some money in their bank account, I don't know, but wouldn't it be something if they could have a little job, have a little money so that they can, I can pay rent for a couple of months, I can get diapers, or whatever it is. Just a little bit, but also a sense of dignity and agency and possibility that this is something new for them. They haven't had this in their lives. Healing practices to lower stress and violence. We did a tapping session and a meditation yesterday, and one of the girls were like, I don't know what this is, well, this is nuts, we don't want to do this. But by the end of that exercise, we were more regulated and more connected, and that's what's possible is, just getting them together and giving them the awareness of their body so that they can start healing. Family centers and parenting classes, please parenting classes, because they're going back to their kids. They need to know about serve and return. They need to know about saying, oh my honey, you're so special. You're so special. That changes the brain. That changes who they are. Suddenly they're like, I can do something. I can do something. But I don't know what it is, but I can do it. So for staff and correctional officers, this is my dream. Ensure environment is highly structured and safe, which you got. Mental health support for all staff, correctional officers, and their families. Educational programs for correctional officers and staff. So a lot of the staff, at least in the U.S., feel like they're being left behind. The residents are getting programs, but they're not. So I don't know if that's true here. And address secondary traumatization among all corrections staff when there's an event, when there's a suicide, when there's an assault. This affects everybody, and same with the residents, everyone. Just like it affects us when we hear what's happening in Ukraine, or we hear of anything that goes on, it all affects us. We're one organism, if you haven't noticed, and it's hard to notice when you're traumatized, but we're one organism. So what goes on in the world affects all of us. Why would a correctional officer want a trauma-informed environment? Jobs become easier. Look, this is what happened. Facilities become safer. Program becomes more productive, effective. Better job-life balance. Less to no symptoms of PTSD, stress, and trauma. Potential for a truly rewarding job. live a longer life. So building bridges. Here's Nadine Mercaris talking with Lewis, and I found out that she was writing to him after that too. So all of this changed his brain, changed the way he felt about himself. And there's Morgan. Morgan did all these slides, by the way. Morgan did an amazing job, and Jamie and Morgan. So there she is, but she's building the bridge right there. And that's one of the things I'm recommending to all of you is find out how you can volunteer in prisons. They need you. They need your sort of return. They need your ability to see them as humans, as beautiful people. I see you. From Barlini. Wow, that's amazing. So building bridges right back to the community and creating a community that isn't drug addicted, that a community that's wholesome and whole. That's the other thing we have to work on. A community that's trauma informed, and I don't know how to do that. I don't know how, but people in prison know how to do that. So that's the thing. Our greatest resource is sitting in a cell for 23 hours doing nothing. And they have the ideas, they know what those people need, and they need to be activated. And if you give them hope and you give them agency and you show them, what can we do? What can we do in this little town, little town that I'm in? I'll call it Briarcroft, which is where I'm staying. What can we do in Briarcroft to bring people together, to make them feel connected and like they belong somewhere? Well, ask the people in prison. They've got the answers. There I am with a rinky-dink check that the guys made. I love that. They raised $2,000 for breast cancer, and they were so proud of their accomplishment. And then right below is a man. His name is Jason Bryant. And his group of friends, they raised $38,000 for a student that was working with them. He couldn't afford tuition for his next year. The year after that, they raised his tuition and they walked him all the way through college. Now, Jason was a lifer. I think he had life without parole. Our governor, it's like our governor, not David Alpert, the governor. Our governor commuted their sentences, all 6 of those men who were the leaders of that initiative. Those men are out now. I think they've been out like 2 years. They just raised $28.5 million for a recovery organization. That's what's in prison. That's the possibilities that are in prison. If you give them the opportunity, they can help change the world. And then, of course, this dog program. They changed all their lives because dogs know about unconditional love. And all of those are rescues. So I would just say the dogs in prison are rescues, the prison residents in prison are rescues. And if you give them love, that's what I'm talking about. Being able to feel safe with other people is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives. That's Bessel van der Kolk, my guy. So I talked a little bit about prisons in Scotland. I think you are on the precipice of massive change. I think there's great leadership here. But I also know that the head office has an idea of what needs to happen in prisons, and I know COVID has taken us back a few years, putting more people in isolation. But my feeling and my firm belief is that communities need to be built in prisons. Isolation is the worst thing we can do. Isolation destroys our ability to connect with humans. Okay, let's see. Okay, so this is Norway. We've all heard of Norway. The only way you can tell that this is really a prison is the officer all the way on the left playing volleyball. So imagine at Barlini, Jim playing volleyball with some of the residents. Or, you know, they have a pitch at Addywell. I don't know if they have a pitch, but imagine Mark playing soccer or football with the residents. I know that's a big stretch, and there's boundaries that have to be kept, but right now it's like this. We can bring it to here, so that there's safety here, and that there's community here. So, in Norway, the only punishment is the loss of freedom. Basic principles, the normality principle, which is just like we do at home, we have our tea, we have our coffee, we do our laundry, we make breakfast, we go to work, and we don't become institutionalized. That's what they want to avoid. Activation, getting them out of their cells. They find that there's less violence if they're out of their cells. So the more you can get them out of their cells, the safer your prison ultimately is. Progression towards reintegration. So if you have someone who's done a violence, but they can demonstrate that they're pro-social and they're healing, give them more freedom, give them more flexibility so that they can grow even faster and more. And the import model, which is bringing the outside in, constantly bringing the outside in, volunteers, family members, other organizations, Cisco's a great example, but bring it in. They need other people than officers in their lives. So, trauma-informed practices, not just ticking a box, right, James? So awareness that prison residents are traumatized. Being aware of and minimizing potentially triggering situations. Understanding scenarios of potential re-traumatization, isolation, violence, chaos, lack of schedule, lack of predictability, lack of consistency. People in prison are like children. They need consistency. They need to know what's happening every day, when it's happening, so their brains can just relax. Untrustworthiness. So if you say you're going to do something and then you don't do it, it sets them 2 steps back. Okay, and I've created an APE test, an adverse prison experience test, which is very similar to the ACEs quiz, but these are re-traumatizing things: neglect, verbal and physical abuse, assault, suicide, rape, and death. And understanding that isolation or neglect contributes to antisocial behavior. So these are guys. We were doing one of our camp songs, and we called them the Star Squad? Starfish Crew. They're the Starfish Crew, and look at them. They're experiencing joy in prison, and that's what we experienced in prison as well in these past 2 days. They were doing, they were surfing, right there, they were surfing. So, pro-social activities, group discussions, support groups, trauma talks, our curriculum, sports discussions, talk about what's going on. Group activities, play, dance, music, art, games, sports, camp songs, puzzles, book clubs, Alcoholics Anonymous, NA. The reason that's so successful is they're in a pro-social environment. Creative endeavors, art projects, writing, poetry, mural painting, group projects, murals, fundraisers, birthdays. Dear Fritzi, if we paid more attention to the high chair, we wouldn't need the electric chair. So, considering everything we've discussed today, the question now is, when will we end the systemic violence inflicted upon the men, women, and children living in prison? When we realize that the people in prison are humans and part of our community and always have been? When will we realize that our society is safer and better when we take care of the most traumatized members of our society? When we stop to listen to their stories? When will we move from violence and dehumanization to education and true rehabilitation? When we come to understand that the violence that takes place in prison doesn't just affect those who live and work there, but the violence ricochets back to our families, our communities, and our society. When is the moment we will begin to forgive people who make mistakes? When we realize that all of us are capable of doing harm and expressing violence? When we come forward with our own hypocrisy? When we forgive ourselves for our participation in the oppression and dehumanization of our own spirit, which leads to the dehumanization and oppression of others? When is the moment we decide we're not going to take it any longer? If you ask me, that moment is now.